In 1960, Frank Packer acquired a venerable, though moribund, Australian institution, the Bulletin. With its famous pink covers and proud slogan, Australia for the White Man, the Bulletin had a reputation for, and I quote, die-hard reactionism even amongst conservatives, end quote, from Donald Horne. Donald Horne folded the Observer into the Bulletin and he created something new and confronting. He hired new writers, he dropped the pink paper and the slogan, he removed the tired cartoons mocking Aboriginal Australians. He was determined to produce a bulletin that included, and I quote, as fellow Australians, women, city dwellers, young people, new Australians, Catholics, Aborigines, scientists, intellectuals, executives, and dozens of other previously forgotten species. And that would accept that Australia adjoined Southeast Asia and that we lived in changing times. For Horne, it was, quote, one further step from pessimism. In transforming the Bulletin, he was rethinking his own views. Horne would leave the Packer Empire soon after. He contemplated a range of other careers. One colleague suggested he become a state Liberal member of Parliament, but instead he joined an advertising agency, and in December 1963 he began writing a book about Australia. This was not a scholarly work. Horne did very little original research and relied instead on old clippings and some field work, such as the visit to the South Sydney Junior Leagues Club that opens the original edition. He had in mind a snapshot of Australia in the age of Menzies. The book, he said, would trace the innocent happiness of Australians, the government by imitation, the politics without ideas, the second-hand culture. Horne wanted a book that was realistic about contemporary suburban living. He wanted to avoid the sort of idealised landscapes of Russell Ward's The Australian Legend. And his key theme was that Australia was fortunate rather than clever or innovative. The book title drew from what became the most famous sentence in the book. Australia is a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. Published late in 1964, The Lucky Country was serialised in The Australian. It sold its original print run in just 9 days. Through multiple editions, it would eventually sell more than 250,000 copies, inspire television documentaries, school exams, and a national slogan that profoundly misunderstood the irony of the title. Megan Morris would later recall reading the book in one sitting, under a tree in her backyard. I had never struck anything like it. We had old Australian novels and a history or two around, she said, but I didn't know that you could write like that about our way of life. Donald Horne found himself suddenly modestly famous, a public intellectual who spoke to and about Australia. The Lucky Country became part of the long process by which Donald Horne transformed himself, in his word, into being unconservative, by deciding that progressive state action was possible. But this was a long and slow change. And in 1964, Donald Horne was reassessing his view of politics. Neither he nor his friends quite perceived that at the time, because in that year he was invited to become co-editor of Quadrant with James Macaulay, and the following year he was invited to return as editor of the Bulletin. By then, Horne was working closely in the Association for Cultural Freedom, alongside Sydney colleagues such as Richard Krieger, David Armstrong, Leonie Kramer, Jim McClellan and Laurie Short, and some new Melbourne friends such as Frank Knopfel-Marker and Bob Santamaria. In their company, Horne embraced a fervent anti-communism that, for a season, marked all of his thinking and writing. Horne later observed, I did fall into folly for something like a year and a half, mainly from ignoring one of the key maxims of sceptical conservatism, par trop de zèle, no excessive zeal. As he concluded, a too passionate rhetoric sacrificed the civil tone that characterised his early writing. But as co-editor of Quadrant, Horne was a familiar advocate of the war in Vietnam, of close ties with America, and a familiar voice in the causes of the right. Indeed, Tribune, the Communist Party newspaper, dismissed The Lucky Country as, quote, right-wing extremism, end quote. Though Horne would later regret a failure to manage his enthusiasm, His anti-communism was shared by many former Andersonians within the Association of Cultural Freedom. Yet over time, he watched the anti-communist movement become conservative rather than libertarian. He found himself being criticised by Leonie Kramer and Peter Coleman for advocating Australian republicanism in the Lucky Country. Richard Krieger took him to task for regular lunches with communist author Frank Hardy. But it was some years before Horne and his longtime political allies parted ways. In 1967, he handed Quadrant to a new editor, but he continued to attend occasional seminars till the 1970s, by which time he judged the Association for Cultural Freedom had become, quote, a fortress defending cultural freedom against the threats of Whitlamism. The decisive break came when Horne criticised Sir John Kerr over the 1975 dismissal. James Macaulay, a friend since 1939, did not speak to him again. Indeed, in his final speech, public speech, the poet condemned the works of Gough Whitlam and his four beasts, Germaine Greer, Manning Clark, Patrick White and Donald Horne. Donald Horne had formed his political identity as a student. He'd contributed to public debate as a journalist and an editor and an author. He joined those former Andersonians who viewed communism as the larger threat to human liberty, and he promoted their arguments with characteristic vigour. In short, this was a cause he shared for decades with his friends. So to break with such company must have been distressing, though Horne said very little about it in his writing. His new political opponents, though, made clear their views. In a review published in Quadrant in 1998, Melbourne University Press publisher Peter Ryan criticised Horne as, quote, the national know-all, a narcissist and showman. Horne would later reconnect with some of his old colleagues, but for many the rift was permanent and bitter. The Lucky Country proved the first of numerous books by Donald Horne. Its success encouraged further volumes of social commentary and a series of autobiographical books that began in 1968 with the education of young Donald. He also got to publish those novels that he'd written some decades earlier. For some years, Horne combined this writing with editing the Bulletin, and it was an influential time. The magazine traced the final long years of the Liberal post-war incumbency. It encouraged the emergence of the arts, for example, as definers of national identity, hiring younger writers such as Sandra Hall to cover film and books. When emerging novelist Frank Morehouse failed to secure a Commonwealth Literary Fund fellowship, Horne offered him a weekly grant through the Bulletin payroll to pursue his writing. It's a Frank Packer fellowship, explained Horne, but don't ever tell Frank Packer. Morehouse would in turn encourage contact with a much younger Sydney literary life. He and Horne became friends as together they participated in the conferences and the workshops and the symposia of the period. Even going to lunch with Donald Horne, recalled Morehouse, was like being part of an endless seminar. Yet Horne sensed his time with the Bulletin drawing to a close. He found the editing task tiresome. He felt out of place in the commercial machinations of the Packer empire. And during a long walk in the city, he decided to resign. Soon after the 1972 federal election, aged 52, Donald Horne left the Packer building for the last time, unsure what to do next. So his choice of academia was unlikely and certainly unplanned. The 2-year research fellowship he was offered in the Faculty of Arts at the University of New South Wales paid less than half his income at the Bulletin. But Horne welcomed an opportunity to write and to think. He was invited to the University of New South Wales by Arts Dean Frank Crowley at a time, quote, of flourishing confidence and expanding budgets, end quote. Though a grateful beneficiary of this largesse, Horne would later head a faculty subcommittee to trim the overstretched arts budget, a role he inherited from historian Alan Gilbert. Horne proved a talented teacher. He'd present about 1,500 or so university lectures over the next 14 years. He could stand at the podium and make the apparently dull constitutional arrangements, the work routines of journalism, meaningful clues to the wider workings of politics and the media. He kept students engaged through striking assertions and rhetorical questions and amusing asides, always remembering to restate and reinforce his central points. When all else failed, a reliable supply of anecdotes and even occasional impersonations of political figures carried him through until 5 minutes to the hour. On campus, Horne watched with amusement the petty politics of academic departments, the corridor of closed doors, office space allocated according to academic rank, the empty common room, the colleagues who never appeared, preferring to eat lunch alone at their desk. Horne set himself the task of mastering academic research. He adopted neat little index cards that he could shuffle and rearrange, though he was never an enthusiast for the apparatus of footnotes and detailed references, and he never moved to learned journals over books. His writing was often criticised for relying too heavily on the telling story, though his apparent fluent and accessible style disguised considerable reading and very careful consideration and construction. He explored various intellectual approaches, behaviouralism, elite theory, recent German writing on political sociology, before settling on political culture as his research topic of choice. This meant the values and the mythologies and the shared assumptions of social and political life. From 1974, Horne began to lecture in first-year Australian politics. He developed a series of courses, upper-year courses on power and democracy, politics and mass culture, and a signature course on politics and the media, all long before cultural studies found a firm place in Australian universities. Like many academics, Horne used teaching to think through new concepts and to develop a structure for the text to follow. Thus, the courses foreshadowed a number of his key works, notably internationally acclaimed The Great Museum from 1984 and The Public Culture from 1986. It seemed the experiment with scholarship had worked. Horne became a senior lecturer, then associate professor, before appointment to a personal chair. He'd eventually become chair of the faculty and a member of the UNSW Council before retiring Professor Emeritus, aged 65, at the close of 1986. Yet social observation was not sufficient after the events of the 11th of November 1975. Horne was profoundly angered by Sir John Kerr's decision to dismiss a democratically elected government that had done nothing illegal. On the day of the dismissal, Horne was lunching with Frank Morehouse and a number of political scientists at the UNSW Staff Club. A young woman waiting on the table was also listening to ABC radio out in the kitchen, and she kept coming out to relay reports that the Governor-General had sacked the Prime Minister. The political scientists at the table carefully explained to her that this could not be correct. Such things do not happen in this nation. The ABC had clearly got it wrong. Once, however, events did become clear, Horne threw himself into political activism. Australia, he felt, must be a republic with a constitution to express the basic principles of democracy. Horne spoke at rallies in support of Whitlam. He wrote letters of protest. He even appeared in a television commercial with Patrick White. As Frank Morehouse recounts, Horne discovered himself as an orator through this process. Until 1975, he prided himself on being a professional independent, neither Liberal nor Labor. He surrendered this neutrality in his passionate response to the 11th of November. After Labor's resounding defeat that year, Horne sought to keep alive the issue of constitutional change. He helped organise public meetings through 1976, culminating in a Citizens for Democracy rally at the Sydney Town Hall, and a new movement to press for a democratic republican constitution. Citizens for Democracy introduced Donald Horne to an unfamiliar form of political engagement: public meetings, pamphlets, banners, resolutions. Yet he watched with dismay as the moment passed. The idea of a new constitution, he lamented, faded like invisible ink. Horne would be similarly disappointed with his involvement in the Australian Republican movement from 1991 under the leadership of first Tom Keneally and then Malcolm Turnbull. Horne found the ARM committee frustrating with, quote, an almost pathological sense of confusion and detachment. So apparently did its leaders. Arriving for one meeting, Horne found Turnbull sitting despondently in the armchair, hands hanging down listlessly, brow furrowed with care. The Republican movement, of course, ended in defeat at a referendum in November 1999. But despite the failure to secure a republic in Australia, This intense involvement in constitutional debate led Horne to see possibilities for public intellectuals in Australian life. It introduced him to community-level politics. It showed that he could speak in compelling phrases. He could command an audience. And in the years that followed, he'd accept almost any invitation to speak at clubs and societies and Rotary gatherings and Liberal and Labor Party meetings and any other opportunity for civil debate. He emphasised this idea of a continuing conversation and for the necessity for democracy to be grounded in local autonomous groups. More broadly, the campaigns for constitutional change affirmed in Horne an understanding of what it means to be a public intellectual. Through his early years at UNSW, Horne had worried that his books were seen as academic or intellectual, as though the only choice was either to speak to other scholars or to address a popular audience. Involvement in public debate convinced Horne that he could speak to both audiences and simultaneously. He wrote admiringly of the high popularisation favoured in France, where new ideas are made accessible by talented writers who together create a shared intellectual life. And it is that notion of a shared life that's important, but a shared life needs nourishment. And in particular, it needs ideas. Without writing about Australian topics, Horne asked, in what sense, as Australians, would we exist at all? This vision of a public conversation informed not just his political activity, but a new role as chair of the Australia Council from January 1985. He wanted to promote the arts as an essential broadening of a political culture otherwise relentlessly focused on economic questions. Those who worked in the Australia Council at the time, such as Andrea Hull, recall their chair filled with plurality and eclecticism and boundless curiosity. They found Horne the ultimate humanist with a fierce sense of nationalism who championed the idea that all Australians have cultural rights. Horne had established for himself a role as a public intellectual. The skill, he believed, is to influence debate through language and through discussion. And a public intellectual should accept invitations to speak no matter how modest the audience, no matter how modest the occasion. In this final segment I'd like to share with you, this comes from Donald Horne speaking about a concept that he developed through these conversations, the idea of the fair go. In 1997, aged 76, Horne published his most ambitious book, The Avenue of the Fair Go, which tried to explain core political concepts through an imaginary theme park of ideas. The Avenue of Fair Go, as you just heard, employed the language of Australian everyday life, and it allowed Horne to distill a lifetime of thinking about Australian political culture. So you can imagine his great disappointment when the book failed to find an audience. Most reviewers were puzzled or hostile, and the book sold less than any of his previous volumes. There would be further publications, but Donald Horne was now speaking to a very different political moment, and his themes of constitutional change and fairness in the Australian character failed to find an audience in the age of John Howard. As his public roles diminished, he had fewer opportunities to engage a wider audience. He remained an occasional columnist and opinion writer. He wrote books such as Looking for Leadership as a polemicist, but he found his ability to be part of the public conversation slipping away. Despite these disappointments, Horne remained an optimist amid the challenges of old age. He completed his series of autobiographical books. He enjoyed some recognition, an Order of Australia in 1983, inclusion in the National Trust's inaugural list of living national treasures, but best of all, a Sydney book launch at which Noel Pearson acknowledged Horne as an elder. Encouraged by Julianne Schultz, the editor of the Griffith Review, Horne began a new project writing about illness and dying. In a remarkable essay, Mind, Body and Age, Horne described infirmity with the same clinical detachment he'd earlier recalled his childhood home or his years as a student. Horne would chronicle his terminal illness in Dying, a Memoir, a work completed by his widow. At the 2004 Sydney Writers' Festival, Donald Horne drew a very large crowd to hear him talk about this essay. He appeared deeply moved by the affection from hundreds of people who packed the Sydney Dance Theatre rehearsal studio. Before he spoke, a small group of us took Donald and Mafani to lunch next door at Walsh Bay. We had the Sydney Harbour lapping against the restaurant. He was frail, his voice was failing, but he was as sharp as engaged as he speculated on the word culture and its meaning, the need for more civic identity, and most enjoyably, the foibles of his former academic colleagues. It was the last time I saw Donald Horne, but he was on that day the same engaging companion who'd entertained thousands of tables through decades of journalism and academia, the same historian, gossip, chronicler and speculator, the writer who asked endless questions and turned your answers into the next phase of the same conversation. In late April 2005, complete with an oxygen mask, Donald Horne finally received a degree from the University of Sydney. Not his abandoned Bachelor of Arts, but an honorary Doctor of Letters. His moving graduation speech praised the marvels of intellectual life with its opportunities for imagination and wonder and inquiry and criticism. He died some months later in September 2005. So how should we remember Donald Horne? Well, his intellectual curiosity ensured he engaged with most of the great questions facing Australia through the 20th century: identity, character, values, place in the world. He explored these issues with the same drive, whether a student or a scholar or a diplomat or a journalist or an editor, an advertising agent or an academic. Donald Horne believed that life has no objective meaning, only the purpose we give our existence. And this means interrogating the moment, understanding the contemporary, and through this moment, the broader patterns of history. His thinking was original. Often only after wrestling with a problem to his satisfaction would he search for the academic literature in the field. His writing was always informed by experience and therefore by the particular circumstances of being in Australia at this moment. His thinking arose from his life, a dialogue between circumstance and reflection. In his earliest years, he disdained political processes, though he remained fascinated by political questions. Later in life, he came to embrace political work, never within a party structure, but instead through writing and public meetings as he sought a vigorous polity filled with conversation. The scepticisms, question everything that he learned from John Anderson served him well through a long life, as did an emphasis on individual liberty and toleration by providing a consistent intellectual stance. But Anderson's hostility to the state proved much less enduring, and Horne eventually broke with this part of the Andersonian program at considerable personal cost to friendships and the settled patterns of his first half century. But he found enjoyment in the unfamiliar challenges of academia and a renewed sense of purpose through political activism. Late in life, this critic of bureaucracy discovered satisfaction in leading organisations, the Faculty of Arts at the University of New South Wales, the Chancellorship of the University of Canberra, 2 terms as chair of the Australia Council. Even in dying a memoir, Horne insisted at a last look around at some familiar questions about politics, about regret, about belief. His final essays should have been followed by 3 questions in 3 hours. So familiar the range of concerns, so close the nexus between the practical problems of living and the intellectual interest in the culture that gives us meaning. This journalist turned academic urged scholars to seek a popular audience, to see virtue in speaking plainly. It is the responsibility of universities, he believed, to create and sustain an intellectual community. Donald Horne's legacy is found in his writing, in the institutions he shaped, the people he trained, the encouragement always to be part of the conversation. This was his vision of a public intellectual at work, a role he once doubted was possible in Australia, but eventually embraced with enthusiasm. It seems impossible to avoid cliches when writing about favourite teachers. All professors become warmly remembered characters, subtly shaping the passing generation of undergraduates, friendly, lively, accessible, tolerant of the gauche. But they may also have been occasionally irritable or bored, is easily overlooked. Yet Donald Horne was always an exceptional teacher, not only in the bare brick rooms of Sydney, but in suggesting how public intellectuals might contribute to their times. Thank you.